This might come across as a bit of a flex, and you might have already noticed this if you saw some of the older videos on my channel. It really isn't a flex. I'll tell you why it isn't a flex. But firstly, the alleged flex. I did a residency at the Wimbledon Championships in 2009. I was on the telly, lots of other stuff, and while I wasn't an official resident poet of the Wimbledon Championships, I did it alongside Ni Aikwe Parks and Roger Robinson, and there was an official poet laureate employed by Wimbledon the year after. We were still employed by the Wimbledon website to go about the Wimbledon Championships, to sample things about the Wimbledon Championships, so everything from the tennis to the culture to the visitors to the staff, and to write poems about it. So that's what I call a residency, even though we weren't official resident poets. We were still employed by the AELTC to write poems. Okay, we weren't just gate crashing the thing. So and when we ended up on BBC Radio and TV, we were always introduced as the resident poets of the Wimbledon Championships as well, and they didn't seem to have a problem with that when that happened. So I'm sounding bitter already. So it's not a flex, because anything that you did 15 years ago and you're not getting similar work right now, how can that be a flex? It's just telling the world you're a has-been. So that's why it's not a flex. But I do remember doing an awful poem. I wrote an awful poem, which is what happens during residencies. You write awful poems. You might write a few good poems, but you don't have time. You don't have time to really just reel off great poems, because great poems sometimes take a bit of time to write and a lot of redrafting. You don't get time for that. You wrote your poem, they marched you up somewhere and they filmed you reading it. That's what I remember. I remember trying to memorize them for the first few days, and then everyone said, chill out, just read them out from your book. And they were right. So I wrote a particularly awful poem, and it got posted by the website, and it was on the last day of the championships, and some smart aleck in the comments wrote, as a poet, don't give up your day job. And I replied, it is my day job, so I'll take that as a compliment. Ow, in your face. It was a good comeback. It was a poem that deserved ridicule, but I say at the same time, as someone who's done commissions, and I don't judge a poet by their commissions. So if I don't think anyone who's actually done that kind of work and understands how that work works, and isn't just some amateur, or that sounds bad, doesn't it? Some amateur. What do I mean by that? Someone who hasn't done the work and is judging people who are doing the work and is viewing it from the outside and just sees it as, I'm better than you, why aren't I getting this work? Because they don't understand how it works, that's why. And I'm not going to waste time saying how it works right now. But it begs the question about the day job. What do you do in your day job as a poet? Most poets don't have a day job in poetry. They teach maybe at a university. Maybe they teach courses for Arvon or the poetry school. Maybe they do school workshops. That's where a lot of performance poets and live poets and spoken word poets, they earn their money by visiting schools and doing workshops there. There's other things, little residencies, little things, but most people, there's a few, but not many, are making money from book sales or from gigs. It's just you do work related to poetry. So that becomes your day job instead. And can that affect your writing? Of course it can affect your writing, because you want those schools to employ you. You want the universities to employ you. You still have employers. Even if you're self-employed, you still have people who become clients. They might as well be employers. So should poets give up their day job? And I would say, on the whole, on most occasions, no. You shouldn't give up your day job. Why? Because being a poet is much more precarious. That's one thing. It's a very small pie, and there's not a lot of stuff to go around. There's not a lot of money to go around, and there's always new people arriving as well who are also expecting a piece of a pie. And the difference between them and you is they're all new and shiny and pretty and not disillusioned with life like you are. So there's that. And then there's a few old timers, and there's a few people that stick to the plan, and they do well, and they have to do well. But the way in which they do well is not only through being good at what they do, which I will not deny. They're normally very good at reading their work, and they write work that people enjoy. But they know how to play the game, and they know how to hustle too. And part of that can be self-promotion, and part of that it can be being very good friends with people on the Arts Council and on the companies that take money from the Arts Council as well. So the organisations as well. They're very good with all of them, and they know how to do that kind of work. So it's all work. So what I'm saying again is that the Arts Council have expectations. the organisations that are funded by the Arts Council also have expectations, often informed by the Arts Council's expectations, and then there's you. Okay, you have to fit with all of that. And you have to know what that is. And that thing is always changing, because sometimes the remit of the Arts Council changes as well. So it's not just something where you're sitting there and you're writing and someone's just throwing money at you. Most occasions it is not that at all. Bukowski is a famous example of the man that gave up his day job, isn't he? Charles Bukowski. And I think there's a problem going on there as well, which is Bukowski is this figure that people gravitate to because he did all these jobs, but he hated those jobs. And then he escaped from those jobs. So if you're doing jobs that are similar to the jobs Bukowski did, maybe low paid, maybe low skilled, maybe precarious, maybe jobs where you are exploited and alienated from the fruits of your labour, and you're writing poems during your leisure times and you just want to escape from it, then that's what Bukowski presents, the escape fantasy. I think that's one reason why Bukowski did so well. But the story of Bukowski is interesting in the sense that the man from the Black Sparrow Press, whose name I forget, loved Bukowski's work so much, he said, how much money do you need to live on? And they worked out what his expenses were for the bars, for the liquor stores, for the racetrack, and other things that he liked doing, and they worked out, and his rent and his food, and they worked out how much he needed, and he said, I will pay you that, and you need to give me just all your writing. I'll publish everything. I'll publish your novels, I'll publish your poems, I'll publish the whole lot. Most people don't get that deal. I mean, he did even better because his poems sold much more than they expected to, even with that initial plan, and so he became quite rich. He had a nice big house and all that kind of thing near the end of his life. And he actually gave up drinking a good few years before the end of his life as well, because he was told by the doctors to. And so he did. So Bukowski's that example. But most people aren't going to get the Bukowski thing. There's a reason why the Bukowski stands in as one particular dream. And I think that's really interesting. So number one, don't quit your day job, because it's going to be tough. It's going to be tough and precarious in its own way, and you just don't know how the landscape can change. So what's the number two reason? Because sometimes your work is more interesting when you have a day job. That a working poet is more interesting. Now, what kind of working poets can we think of? We can think of people who are working very successful and high-paid jobs, like Wallace Stevens. Wallace Stevens was the vice president of an insurance company and was known to get quite angry when people phoned him up about poetry during work hours. And then he'd go for his little walk around the lake and he'd write his philosophical, imagery-driven poetry. And I like the work of Wallace Stevens. I don't think I'd be friends with Wallace Stevens if I met him in real life, because he did seem to be a racist. Or he seemed to be... Some of his poetry uses racist language in quite a casual way, let's just say, and it's meant to be that his common speech was like that as well. So, you know, I still love lots of his poems. I still love Ideas of Order at Key West, but ultimately wouldn't be his friend. But he didn't write about being an insurance vice president either. And I think me included, my first collection of poems, You're Not Singing Anymore, which is going to be 20 years old this year. That book of poems I think was interesting. I don't think they're technically as good. I think I have better technique now as a poet than I did then. But those poems spoke to people. Why did they speak to people? Because of the life I was living and the things I was writing about. That spoke to people. I don't think I've written anything since then. Maybe the mundane comedy, or Now Is Not the Time for Politics, which was a sequence of poems where I wrote a terza rima poem every day for a year. But most of that was about becoming a father for the first time. People connect with that. So, and I really wanted to record it, and I still think that was a cool way of recording it. So maybe that was the other time that I really connected with people. Since then, it's just me writing Zen Buddhist stuff, but people probably don't even know what I'm writing about right now. So yeah. So I normally say, hello, my name is Niall. I'm a poet who writes essays and makes videos because the muse has abandoned me. But actually, I've been writing poems again recently, so I feel like I'm lying with that introduction. So that was my thing. So I felt that giving up my day job, actually, in some ways, I was less able to connect after that. And I think doing work and writing about work, it's something that people should do more. Not a lot of people do it. Here's a famous poet who's done it. Fred Voss. There we go. Here's two of his books. There's another two books. I couldn't find them. And actually, one of them's I really love. I think I like these two books a lot. But so Hammers and Hearts of the Gods and Carnegie Hall with Tim Roofs were his other two books. He might have done other books as well. But Fred Voss is really interesting because for most of his life, I think he might be retired now, but he worked as a machinist. There we go. A machinist is another word for machine operator. He worked as a machinist, and he wrote about his work. He still writes about the work, actually. He still writes about the culture. So he worked at this job. I think, unlike Bukowski, there are things he likes about the work. He likes being at his machine. It's skilled labour working as a machinist, as an engineer. And so he really does enjoy that element of his work. There's a danger to it. There's these big ungainly machines, these very heavy weights that he uses. And it's a skilled job, but it's a tough job as well. But there's something about that work that he finds fulfilling. I don't think you get that in Bukowski's work. I think in my poems about employment, I think there are some elements of that, but my fulfillment, the meaningfulness of labour, I think is there. But I think Fred Voss, he writes about that. He really writes about the flow state that he goes into when he's working at his machine. But he also talks about his fellow machinists, the ones who refuse to work, the ones who hate him because they can tell he's a bit arty-farty. They might not know he's a poet, but they know that he likes art and he likes reading books of poetry, which is bad enough. And from that one, he wrote a poem called A Fret, which is fantastic, which is where he's aware that they hate him because of his artsiness. And I had a similar thing where my fellow workers saw that I was kind of educated and inherently distrusted me because of that in my gardening job that I did. But he writes this poem about how he's going to plan to bring a rose in to work every day, and he's going to put a rose in a little jar of water. He really wants to terrify his fellow workers this time. So he writes about that tension between himself and his fellow workers, the tensions they have of each other. And then finally he writes about the alienation, and there's two forms of alienation in his work. And I think his work begins quite interestingly. So in Goodston, so if we go from one of the earliest books, the poems are quite tight and anecdotal, and I find that his work becomes more lyrical. And I think you can even see the poems look different. Look at the variations in line length in these poems, from the earth and stars in the palm of our hand. And then look at the poems here in Goodston. Okay, they look kind of similar, but they're shorter, they're terser, and they're just a bit more anecdotal. Whereas I think they become more lyrical as he goes on. And I think they become more politically engaged as well, or more explicitly political about the labour struggle as he goes on as well. So he also writes about the culture of the office, and sometimes the office is in the same building. It's that thing up the stairs where there's the guy who sometimes marches down. You know, they have the office high up so they can look over everyone. They walk down and they threaten everyone's jobs. And he sums it up as the people who have carpet beneath their feet, walking down to the shop floor where they have concrete beneath their feet instead. And then he writes about the greater alienation. And in Hammers and Hearts of the Gods, he writes a few poems about the fact that he's working, so one of these jobs he's working in, he's making precision parts for aircraft. And these aircraft are military aircraft, and they're the aircraft that are going to Iraq and Afghanistan, the war on terror, this thing that he fundamentally disagrees with, and yet his work is enabling it. So there's alienation in that sense. The alienation of labour from the Marxist point of view is not just about the value, the people that you're making very rich, but they're making all of that from your work. They're taking a quite a big slice of the real value of your labour in order to make themselves incredibly wealthy while you struggle. But the other element of alienation is the way in which a hunter-gatherer tribe, for instance, and I know this is a very kind of rose-tinted way of viewing it, but one thing that hunter-gatherer tribes have is that they see the meaning of their labour if they hunt, if they forage, if they build things around their village, if they look after the children. They see the immediate effects and value of their labour. But in a post-industrial, it's still industrial, it's not really post-industrial, but in a capitalist economy, then we're not seeing those results. We're not seeing where our labour goes. We're not seeing the effects of our labour, and sometimes the effects of our labour is not a good thing. So he captures all of that. I think he captures the contradictoriness of that, and I think that's the reason why he never wanted to leave his job, because it's something that connected him to the world. It connected him to society. It connected him to other people. And in those connections, he could create his poetry. And he didn't have an arts council or an organisation or any other kind of patron to flatter and impress at the same time. And I think that's an important thing. So I think when you have your own job, not only do you have something interesting to write about because you're engaging with humanity, you're part of the rat race, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, because that's the life most people are living. And if you know about that life and can communicate about that life, then you can find solidarity as well. And I think that that's another reason not to give up your day job if you are a poet, because your day job, no matter what it is in some ways is more interesting than being a poet. The life of a poet can actually be quite boring. I know if you're super famous, if you're like famous Seamus Heaney, and I think there's another example there. Famous Seamus Heaney, the poems that, you know what? Just outside, I was just looking and I saw a crow land on a chimney pot and go, "Ah, ah." And when I said famous Seamus Heaney and that crow landed and made that noise, I wondered if his mate Ted Hughes had like sent the crows after me for a second. But anyway, back to famous Seamus. He famously writes that poem, Digging. One of the poems that really helped him to break out, you know, the death of a naturalist. I sometimes say death of a naturist, which sounds like something completely different, but a death of a naturalist. And the final lines in Death of a Naturalist, not the final line, sorry, the final lines in Digging. The cold smell of potato mould, the squelch and slap of soggy peat, the curt cuts of an edge through living roots awaken in my head, but I've no spade to follow men like them. Between my finger and my thumb the squat pen rests, I'll dig with it. I used to love that last line, especially when I was working as a gardener and I was digging every day. But afterwards I couldn't get the image out of my head as I got older of Seamus Heaney's dad, because the poem is about him watching his dad working in the field digging up new potatoes, and he also remembers his granddad cutting peat at a bog as well, and him handing him a bottle of milk corked with paper, and his granddad takes a glug, and that man could handle a spade like his father before him. So there's this lineage of men handling spades, but there he is in his little pen writing his little poems. And I often think, and obviously that feeling of being a bit of a class traitor pervades the whole work. And I think that that last line, the squat, you know, between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests, I'll dig with it. I couldn't help but think of Seamus Heaney's dad in the field, looking up at his bone-idle son, watching him do a proper day's work and going, look at me, I'm writing a poem, digging a hole, I'm writing a poem. Apologies to all Northern Irish friends. My family are from Cork, so I don't think I have the right to do a Northern Irish accent, but yet it's just, I think it portrays the imagined character of Seamus Heaney's dad a little bit. Okay, just allow me this one more, which is Seamus Heaney's dad, after saying I'm writing a poem, digging holes, he gets a little trowel and he goes, haiku. Okay, that's it, I'm done. Okay, no more. But anyway, but you can see when you turn it around, it makes you realise how ridiculous the thing Seamus Heaney says is. And I think there is a tradition where the poet observes the labourer and mythologises the labourer and aestheticises the labourer. And sometimes the poet tries to borrow the credibility of the labour of their ancestors and even their parents and grandparents in order to lend credibility to their own work. I was part of a Zoom meeting a few years ago, and there were a lot of young poets, some of them British, some of them American, and they all seemed to really write a lot of stuff about all the tough jobs their parents and grandparents did, but there didn't seem to be a lot about them doing those tough jobs. Now, I'm not saying they can't do that. Why not find meaning in that? But again, isn't it interesting when poets can't find meaning in their own lives because they're not engaged in that meaningful struggle? Isn't that interesting? I say this again, and this is one more thing to say, which is I hosted an open mic. By the way, yeah, so don't give up your day job. Don't become reliant maybe on doing a regular hosting gig, which seems like the most reliable thing in the world until there's a pandemic, and then that hosting gig is taken away from you and the venue never opens again for reasons I won't go into because I'm not entirely aware of them. And there's a petition you can sign if you want to put a bit of pressure into reopening the Poetry Cafe in Covent Garden. But anyway, where was I? I was talking about hosting the open mic there, and there would be people that would turn up still wearing their work clothes, some of them who did work as caretakers, as gardeners, as factory workers, and you'd have the office workers come in again. And one of the most gratifying things about that job is to see at the end of an evening someone who has been working in a manual job chatting with a very high-powered corporate lawyer, both of them just chin-wagging about poetry over a beer at the end of the evening. I like that kind of thing. I'm not anti-lawyers. I'm not anti-high-flying jobs. I like social cohesion. I like it when people are able to meet and talk about stuff and go beyond their personal differences. And I really miss the open mic scene because that was one thing that it facilitated. But the other thing I missed about that open mic scene is that the lawyer had no problem writing about his job. He'd write about other experiences as well, but he would write about that because it's an interesting thing to write about because not many people do it. But at the other end of the scale, often those guys with the high-vis jackets, the ones who arrived in their work clothes, would not write about their work. They would often write quite abstract, rebellious Ginsberg-esque poems, perhaps, just or Blakean poems of revolution. But they didn't recognise their own work as part of that instrumentation of revolution. And I mean, I say Ginsberg, I single out Ginsberg because, hey, I think I've got one of Ginsberg's poems somewhere in the final lines of Allen Ginsberg's America. It's true, I don't want to join the army or turn lathes in precision parts factories. I'm nearsighted and psychopathic anyway. Well, you do have poets who turn lathes and work precision parts in factories. Who else? William Letford, or Billy Letford. I think as an author, he's William Letford. His first book, Bevel, is fantastic. Bevel, it's called. And he's written about being a roofer. And he writes about that work because most of us haven't been roofers. And one thing I like about his poems, it's about the danger and the alienation of his work. But it's also about being someone who works between the earth and the sky. There's one wonderful poem about, I think he went and did some work in an Italian village. And there's one church, I think, in the village which doesn't have a roof. And the poem ends about how the people in that village joke that their roof, which just opens up to a starlit sky, is far better than that one, in Vatican City, the Sistine Chapel, because they really have the creation above their church peering in at them. And I think that's a poetics that maybe only comes from that only a roofer would perhaps have pointed out and understood and picked up on. The idea of there being no roof for a start. And so he writes about, again, the precariousness of his job. He writes about the danger of his job, but he also writes about the satisfaction of his job as well. And I think you have to be a worker to really write about that. I think if you're not that kind of worker, you're not going to capture that. And so I want to make this a shorter one. So I would recommend, if you are a poet, and you're in a day job and you sometimes get caught in the Bukowski trap, I would say it's not as good on the other side of things as you think it might be. Not that I'm in a rush to go back to the gardening job because my body is old and useless and frail now. I'm not the strong young man I once was. I think I'd just be awful. I'd keel over and do my back in within an hour. But so I'd probably, to go back into the workforce, I'd probably have to do something different. Right now, I do my lecturing and I just look after my kids. I'm a kind of lecturer, part-time lecturer and house husband. That's ultimately what I am right now, because other stuff has dried up for reasons already explained. And so I wouldn't give up your day job for that. One, because you're not going to find this, you might still have more security in your day job. Two, you'll enjoy your art a lot more. It's your escape. Three, you won't have to answer to anyone. You don't have to answer to anyone. You're writing your work and your livelihood is not threatened by the work that you write. You really can speak your mind. You really can write the things that you want to read, because it's the things that you write and send out into the world don't have immediate repercussions on your livelihood. And I think the other thing is that you can inspire other working people. You have the most sublime subject matter in the world. Who's the other poet that did a job that was a high-powered job? Oh, T.S. Eliot, working as a banker when he for Lloyd's of London. That was the other one. There's a documentary from the BBC saying this ridiculous line about T.S. Eliot looked more like a banker than a poet, and maybe they were being witty or maybe something, but yeah, he was a banker. That's why. Maybe. What's a poet meant to look like? I don't understand. So too, yeah, it's especially if you're in that work, you can find solidarity in the labour struggle. And I did want to finish this by giving a little shout out to a friend of mine, Brothers Grimm, because he's always mentioning this in the comments. But he does something fantastic, which is poetry on the picket line, poets on the picket line. And he and a group of poets, when there's a strike on, be it, and there's a lot of strikes at the moment, be it the rail workers, the tube workers. I haven't done it yet, which is terrible. But I'm weird. I'm weird and introverted, and I quite like stages, and I sometimes feel a bit vulnerable when I'm just doing my poetry on a street corner. I really admire people that can do that, but I'm too self-conscious. But it takes a lot of guts to do that work as well. But to have solidarity poetry on the picket line, it's a brilliant thing. And I know that Chip is planning other things, but I don't think I've got permission to talk about them. If I have got permission, I'll talk about them in another video. But I just wanted to end this by giving a shout out to poets on the picket line. Poetry can be meaningful. Poetry can be tied in with labour in meaningful ways. And I think two things that can help that along the way is, if you're doing a job and you think it's a job that's beneath the subject of poetry, that's probably the best indicator that you'll ever have that it is the ideal subject for poetry. And two, actually, another thing I'd like to say is, when we talk about precarious labour and the precariat, we're talking about the gig economy, aren't we? We're talking about people who are doing Deliveroo, the Amazon drivers, stuff like that. That's where I want to see the work coming out. Honestly, so many ways when we talk about skilled labour, or even my work as a semi-skilled labourer, as a gardener, in many ways that work is kind of less precarious than people who are right at the edge of a gig economy. And if I was running the open mic now, I would really try and do as many things as I could to encourage the people who do that kind of work to come in and talk about their kind of work. Because in some ways they are so important, because their lives aren't being spoken about. And I don't mean in some, again, I spoke about Perfect Days by Wim Wenders last week, which I think is a beautiful film, but it does sanitize and aestheticize the labour, casual labour for middle class audiences. And what I would love to see is, I spoke a little bit about gig workers and toilet cleaners and other labourers seizing the means of production last week, because they got phones with cameras on. Nearly everyone's got a phone with a camera on, even if it's a potato. The camera is more capable now than it ever has been. People could make their own films. They could do their own guerrilla filmmaking in one way or another. But poetry, man, you can just... Some of my best poems were poems I wrote in a notes app on my phone. And for a lot of poets, it's the same thing. And I would just say, if you're doing that work and things happen and you observe things, just... If you're able to, I know you might have the supervisor breathing down your neck, but if you're able to for a second, just get something down about that. I think there's magic to be made there. So yeah. And at the same time, if you do want to give up your day job and become a poet, that's fine. But goodness me, make sure that the chances of you being one of these so many big guys that can be counted on one hand, well, maybe two hands, that can really make a good living without having to do so many things and compromise in so many ways. Chances are, you might have to get back to the work, to the rat race again at some point. So I would just say yes. Those are all my reasons for not giving up your day job, especially for poetry. And I will leave it there. Have a good one.